hopefully you guys enjoyed your tea, enjoyed your break, because what I'm going to try and do with my presentation is convince you of a proposition. That proposition is that a lot of what you've been hearing so far today has been very aspirational. Lots of ideas about POCs and pilots that folks want to do, thinking about use cases, but basically planning on the future and where blockchain is going, where distributed ledger technology is going. And I'm actually going to make the thesis today that the future is actually here. God, that sounds really cliched. Sorry about that. But actually, what we are doing at R3, we're all actually already in production. We already have a pipeline of projects and solutions that people are developing, or not just developing, actually running in production. So I'm going to make the case for why they are doing this, why are they doing this on our platform, but also the takeaway from that is the use cases that you guys have been thinking about and hearing about today are actually fairly solid. It isn't just malarkey from other blockchain vendors. No, they're all on the right track, and you guys are on the right track for thinking about this. So just by way of introduction, A, I like my wine, but B, I used to work for IBM for a long time. So I'm a long time IBMer before I came to R3, and I also used to work on Hyperledger Fabric. So I had a history with Fabric and a history with Hyperledger. So I kind of come from that middleware background, the data background, and how it applies to enterprises, which is a much different approach, much different way of thinking than if you came at this from the cryptocurrency side of the house. So if you came from Bitcoin, if you came from Ethereum, you kind of have your way of looking at the world, and you kind of look through the crypto lens in that respect. I came from the background that basically said the software and the hardware solutions that we're selling are in the service of some business, and some business solution, and in some enterprise. So that's the way I'm thinking about this. Just very quickly, because sometimes there's some confusion around this, R3 is a company that's been around for a couple years, since about 2015 or so. We actually began life as a research company, basically looking at cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology on behalf of financial institutions primarily. So they would join R3 and pay for our research. We would run pilots on Ethereum, we would run pilots on Hyperledger Fabric on behalf of financials and related kinds of industries. What we have done since then is pivot to being an enterprise software company. So we kind of realized that the market needed an enterprise blockchain, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that also allowed us, or essentially necessitated, that we had to change our business focus. So our focus now, we still have membership, still people join R3, we run pilots and do research on behalf of those clients, but we are basically an enterprise software company building out the Corda platform. Now we did this, we had the advantage of doing this by having this membership. So all these different companies had basically joined R3 or paid a membership to R3. But when it came time for us to take a look at blockchain technology, and if we were going to do one from scratch, what kind of requirements do we need to do in order to fulfill that? So we had that luxury of going and gathering functional and non-functional requirements from all of these major banks and financial institutions and design a blockchain from scratch. So very briefly on Corda, I don't necessarily want to shill Corda per se, although I'm shilling Corda per se, but also this leads into why the use cases that have emerged and why people have been successful bringing these to production. So I mentioned again that we started life as a research arm. So Bitcoin comes along, and then a number of other cryptocurrencies come along. And Ethereum comes along and introduces the notion of smart contracts, which of course kind of revolutionizes the blockchain space. And suddenly people get excited about blockchain and distributed ledger technology beyond just the cryptocurrency use case. At this stage, I was still at IBM. So IBM took a look at this and said, this is actually fairly interesting technology from an enterprise standpoint. However, it's not going to be suitable for enterprises because it's permissionless, it's anonymous, anybody can onboard. So right away you're violating KYC, AML kind of edicts. Therefore, we need to create something that's going to be suitable for the enterprise. Basically, IBM just took Ethereum model, pulled out the Ethereum, pulled out the currency, pulled out the gas, pulled out the heavyweight consensus, and said that's open blockchain, which became the foundation for Hyperledger Fabric. At this time, again, I was still at IBM. We saw some interesting use cases where we'd plug our IBM software into this stuff and see how it would run. But across the road, R3 was looking at this on behalf of the banks and saying, okay, Fabric is a step in the right direction, at least from an enterprise standpoint. But there's still some issue with this, especially from a financial institution standpoint. And that issue is, in a traditional blockchain, I'm suggesting a transaction. If we decide on the validity of the transaction via a smart contract and the logic around that contract, we reach consensus throughout the network, and then we take that transaction, put it in a block, hash it onto the chain, and everybody gets a copy of it. Everybody gets a copy of that block. So there's a global representation of state, and everyone has a copy of it. If I'm Citibank, that means JP Morgan is holding my data. Or if I'm DBS, UOB is holding my data. Now that data is encrypted, of course, but A, that data is sitting on their servers, B, quantum computing one of these days, and C, it has been shown that you can apply analytics to the patterns of transactions and kind of sort of guess at what's going on. Maybe not to level of granularity that's really threatening, but nevertheless, Citibank can maybe kind of sort of figure out that DBS and MUFG are talking, or transacting together. So that was the problem we saw with traditional blockchains as it applied to financial and heavily regulated industries. And that was the genesis of Corda and the Corda platform. So I'll go into a bit more detail about that. It's important to remember how folks were looking at this and why they thought this was interesting in the first place. So again, you might have, I've certainly been at my share of conferences where the Bitcoin maximalists, or to some extent the Ethereum maximalists, will say, look, a blockchain is only a cryptocurrency, or it's only Bitcoin, and any other context is not applicable. But really, when you stop and think about it, and again, coming at it from my background in middleware and data, when all is said and done, the blockchain is just a shared database with some unique characteristics such as append-only operations. That's it. There's no reason to necessarily overthink that. So if I just take that concept, then the cryptocurrency is just an application that's running on top of that layer. And I can take the cryptocurrency off as an application and put on some other application like supply chain or trade finance or payment settlement or what have you. Now maybe I still use the currency or a token because it makes sense to do so in a business context, but I don't necessarily have to. And once you've separated the currency from that data layer, then it becomes clear what the value of a blockchain, at least a blockchain pattern, is as a data pattern. It's a way to get through transactions and arrive at some shared facts that we can agree on. Once upon a time at IBM, I used to sell clients very expensive software that would try and achieve the same thing, doing B2B operations over different B2B protocols, using J2E transactions, two-phase commits, et cetera, et cetera. But then having something like a blockchain-style solution allows me to actually get away from that and get to a point where myself and whoever I'm trading with, my counterparties, can arrive at the same view of the data and trust that view of the data. So all of the blockchains pretty much share these kinds of capabilities in common. There isn't that much difference at the most basic architectural level. We all are relying upon cryptocurrency and digital signing and encryption, which buys us in turn the immutability, the fact that we're connecting the data, the most recent data, into previous data such that we can't go back and change it without breaking it. The smart contracts as a way to introduce some application logic to all of this. The shared ledger concept, so that once we've agreed on that transactional data, we can put it out in such a way that those of us who should see it can see it. and then finally some consensus mechanism to agree on what that data should be. So whether you're talking about Fabric, whether you're talking about Ethereum, whether you're talking about Corda or VeChain, we all share these same basic architectural concepts. Where Corda differs, and this is kind of the end of my Corda shilling, where Corda differs is on the emphasis upon privacy. So remember our original point, our original problem with blockchain was if Citibank does a transaction with JP Morgan, there's no reason for DBS to receive a copy of that or have that sit on their servers. So Corda, by design, is on a need-to-know basis. All the transactions are done purely on whoever is invited to that transaction, and that's it. So if Tom and Dave do a transaction, there's no reason for Amit to receive a copy of that, unless we permit him to do so, or unless we include him as a regulator or something like that. So right off the bat, it's an emphasis upon privacy. Secondarily, again, knowing that we were kind of serving the enterprise, we started with also, besides the privacy aspect, we also said, okay, we have to achieve finality, transactional finality. That's one of the issues with traditional blockchains as well, is they theoretically may not achieve finality. In Corda, by design, we have transactional finality as part of that privacy angle. What we also do, by design, is reuse as much existing technology as possible. So we didn't necessarily want people, for example, to go out and have to learn Solidity, have to be cutting edge with Golang or something like that, or NoSQL databases. We reuse Java, JVMs, because well understood technology and millions of Java programmers. We use relational databases so that you can actually run reports against your ledgers. And we use message queuing for all the point-to-point protocol, all the point-to-point messaging. The contracts are also one other key differential. So again, bearing in mind that we were serving KYC, AML institutions, we decided that the smart contract had to be much more modular than traditional smart contract in blockchain. So when you talk about creating a distributed application in Ethereum or Fabric, you're really talking about writing the smart contract. What we did was we broke that smart contract out, and really, it's fair to say it's a dumb contract. It's not really doing a whole lot other than stipulating the terms and conditions of a valid transaction, and that's it. It evaluates out to true or false. If I have 10 conditions listed, we meet all 10 conditions, it's true. Otherwise, it's false, and it fails. So it's very deterministic, it's very clear, and also it can map to legal prose. So, for example, Arthur was making the point about the formality of the contract and the ability to validate that. Well, part of how we address that is we have the ability to attach a legal document to the transaction, to the smart contract, such that if, for example, Amit disputes the transaction that we just did for $1 million or what have you, we can have that, we can revert back to the legal document and have that fairly adjudicated in a court of law. So we actually basically map legal prose from a legal document to the contract, or reflected in the contract. And finally, because of the design, because it's need-to-know basis transactions, it's peer-to-peer messaging, using Java JVMs and so forth, we've been able to achieve fairly high performance standards in terms of TPS, just on a per-node basis. But even more so, we can horizontally scale. In the DTCC in New York City, Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, which does all security settlements in the US, ran a performance and scalability test of all 4 major blockchains. They published 2 of them. The other 2 asked not to be named. The 2 that passed were digital assets and Corda. And we were both able to achieve sustained 6,000 TPS over 5-6 hours and a high watermark of 20,000 TPS. The other 2 blockchains, which shall not be named, but are pretty much the other big blockchains in the space, did not pass. They basically crashed. And again, it's partially because of the engineering design of what they're trying to do versus the way Corda or even how digital assets are designed. All right, so what I really wanted to get to was the use cases in my remaining 11 minutes or so. So as it turns out, if you design a blockchain from the ground up, or DLT, from the ground up to the rigorous standards of a KYC, AML type of institution, financials, banks, so on and so forth. Turns out other industries like that. They like that privacy aspect, they like the performance aspect, they like the reusability of the technology. So it's not that we're not perfect for every possible use case, of course not. There's still great use cases for public blockchains, for Hyperledger, and so on. But again, we were designed for some specific requirements that, as it turns out, are common to other industries. And as a result, Corda has actually only been released as 1.0 since the end of 2017. And we're already in production with about 20 different systems since that time. It's only a year and a half. And probably dozens, if not more, in the pipeline, ranging from the financial kinds of applications that you might imagine to a lot of industries, for example, we didn't really anticipate. So, for example, my good friend Deepthi from Microsoft cited a couple trade finance applications. These are large consortiums, typically of banks, of shippers, of corporates that are basically doing trade finance. In the case of Voltron, it's e-documents. In the case of Marco Polo, it's account opening and full account life cycle. We also have delivery of payments in Thailand, which Deepthi also mentioned, as well as a company called Finacle Connect with the solution. One of the more interesting projects that we're working on is central bank digital cash with the Bank of Thailand, which again, Deepthi mentioned that one. Maritime insurance with InsureWave, which he mentioned. But we also have a small startup company called Vessel that's doing basically insurance matching between small and medium businesses and maritime shippers. There's several large insurance consortiums that have chosen the standard on Corda. B3I, RiskBlock. B3I is for reinsurance. RiskBlock is more general purpose insurance platform. Another consortium in India and Italy. But that represents most of the insurance industry right there. And my colleague Amit will talk more about that on the insurance panel. Syndicated lending with Finestra. So somebody mentioned on the panel earlier about syndicated lending and how that seems like that would be a very powerful use case. Well, this is actually in production. Finestra is in production with LenderCom running on Corda. Digitized precious metals and trading on Tradewin. High-value liquid assets on HQLAX. Oil gas royalties on Guild 1. Supply chain track and trace for healthcare clinical trials on HS blocks. And corporate KYC and consumer KYC developed by some partners, Gemalto and Synchron. These are all either in production or near production. So these are systems that are actually live and running. A little further on the in production track, not quite as far along, these are more recent, but land registration in the United Kingdom by the government, the UK government, will all be on Corda. Digital platform lending, this is being developed as we speak in Thailand. This is a partner in Thailand. Food supply chain provenance with Ripe.io. This was announced just last week. Domestic interbank reconciliation with SIA. Again, this was a recent announcement. Supply chain management, tokenization of corporate currency is an interesting one that we're developing with some partners in Japan, but it solves a really clear pain point that very large corporations have, and that is the lack of visibility and liquidity and transparency into corporate cash, particularly for a large international corporation. So basically tokenizing that cash and then applying analytics to that tokenization in order to control it, exit out to different kinds of fiat currencies. The one that I somehow inexplicably left off here was the one that the gentleman from Swiss Stock Exchange mentioned. That is the Swiss Digital Exchange is being built on Corda. So that entire digital asset ecosystem is being built on the Corda platform. We have some other partners that are building parts of that, such as corporate actions and standard settlement instructions. So we're really kind of building out that whole digital asset ecosystem, which kind of leads into my next point. So we've had some recent announcements that have garnered some interest. We created a payment settlement application that's open source. Anybody can download it, anybody can use it or plug into it or what have you. And when we first did it, we did it for XRP, for the Ripple protocol standard. And that got a lot of people very excited that, oh my God, R3 and Ripple have settled their differences and are in bed together. No, not quite. It's just that it was very easy to do as a kind of as an MVP. But now we announced a partnership with Swift. So Swift GPI will plug into our payment settlement application, or actually vice versa. We'll plug into the GPI network. And again, the announcement about the Swiss digital exchange was a big news for us. What this indicated was a pivot, or not quite a pivot, but in addition to what we were working on and the way we were thinking about this space. So a year and a half ago, we would never touch coins or tokens, because that was the ICO world, that was ERC 2721. But nevertheless, people were out there raising capital, using ICOs and so forth. But when the ICO market kind of collapsed, it suddenly became safe to start talking about coins and tokens from an enterprise context. And I mentioned that, that corporate treasury, the international conglomerate, tokenized cash, those kinds of conversations actually start to introduce a completely different concept of coins and tokens that suddenly made it safe for us to look at this and say, there's more to this than just ICOs. So we get beyond raising capital and start to think about new markets, to talk about operational efficiency of those markets, and actually solve some problems that enterprises have using tokenized and digitized assets. So what we've started to do is, of course, you still have the core to blockchain layer. People still build applications on that. But we're starting to build out a library of middle tier components that will make it easier, for example, for SDX, for SIX, to build out their digital exchange, or for people to build out post-trade settlements, corporate actions, things like that. So we've really started to look a lot more closely at what's going on in the digital asset space. We have a number of tokens and coins that we're building that are for private networks. They're not going to be going on public networks. They will be for folks that, for example, want to do whitelisted trading, want to create a digital marketplace, want to represent a particular kind of asset or asset class. But we also have some partners that are doing things like tokenizing ERC 2721 on Corda or Bitcoin on Corda, so that I can represent those transactions on a private Corda network, permission network, even though it's coming from a public network. So basically, there's a lot happening in this space that we're working on. I have about 2 minutes, so I wanted to quickly kind of draw this to a close, just in case there were any questions I could answer real quick.
Thank you. Yes, there are some questions.
I was afraid of that.
So the first, while many others are still at POC or pilot, how did Corda progress into production so quickly?
Great question. I think part of the reason was the advantage of the design of Corda. Again, the Corda programming model is very modular. We separate the data model from the contract, from the actual workflow it takes to get to a transaction, and it's all in Java. And it all uses relational databases and messaging. So the learning curve to actually get up and running on Corda is fairly flat. It's very easy. And in fact, some of the anecdotal comments that we've gotten from Fabric programmers or Ethereum developers is once they had that initial learning, they found it much easier to design and develop an application. And we would have people go into production from design to MVP in as little as, say, 4 to 6 weeks.
Thank you. And next question. Are there too many blockchain protocols? How many do you think will survive? And which ones, other than Corda?
Too much is never enough. That's another great question. I think there will be a great reckoning of the blockchain protocols. Somebody wiser than myself once pointed out that it's really the ones that are probably best to bet on, and I'm on thin ice here, but this was someone else's quote, not mine, is the ones that have a consortium model. That there's more than one participant contributing to that ecosystem, to that solution. So obviously, Ethereum fits that. Obviously, Hyperledger fits that. Corda fits that. That's not to say that's going to be the golden standard, but again, that seems to be part of the feeling of it. But but there is also a need for different use cases. So there isn't going to be one blockchain to rule them all, of course. Now there may become one that becomes a backbone. I know Ethereum is trying to do that. We'll see if that happens.
And final question.
Yes.
Why has JP Morgan left and built their own?
Yes, my good friend Amber Baldet. Well, so JPM had that in the works while they were still a member of R3. And so I think in the end they decided to make that bet on their technology. And they got kind of far with it for a while. And then Amber left and it languished for a while. But it seems to have found some renewed purpose. So it's emerging as a formidable competitor for both us, for IBM, Fabric, and so forth. I think what remains to be seen is what JPMC is going to do with Quorum, because they're a bank, they're not a software company. So will they spin it off? Will they sell it? Will Microsoft take it over? That remains to be seen. I don't think JPMC will keep Quorum, because that's just not their base business model, but we'll see. They might be using it to build out their payments networks, for example.